Summer is in full swing, and a group of young Americans, Jack, Emma, Sarah, Ben, and Mike, have decided to spend a weekend outdoors. It was Jack's idea, who had learnt about a lost lake deep in the woods from his uncle. The lake was far from civilization, hidden by dense forests and surrounded by a mysterious halo, making it the perfect place for an adventure. The first hours of the trip passed in carefree merriment. The friends discussed their plans, joked, laughed loudly, and put on their favorite music. But as they turned off the tarmac road onto a narrow forest path, the atmosphere began to gradually change. The road became more and more bumpy. The trees grew thicker and thicker, and it seemed that the forest was literally swallowing them. The boys rode in silence, no longer as confident as before. There was only them and nature ahead, wild, unbridled, unpredictable. After a few hours of traveling, they finally reached their destination. Before them was a view of a tranquil lake framed by a dense forest. The lake looked peaceful, but something in its stillness was unsettling. The water was still as a mirror, reflecting the dusky sky, and the trees seemed to overhang the shore, creating a sense of isolation. Even so, the friends set to work with enthusiasm, setting up camp and building a fire. Their anxious thoughts quickly dissipated, giving way to the joy of being in nature. The sun was beginning to set when they finished their preparations. A strange, almost oppressive silence enveloped the lake and the forest. It seemed that the whole world around them held its breath. The boys laid out their sleeping bags, gathered around the fire, and prepared for dinner. Fire-roasted sausages and smoky potatoes cheered up the company a little, and soon they began to talk about various topics, from the urgent to the absurd. "You know," began Mike, as the darkness of night finally enveloped the camp, "people often see strange things here in these woods." "Mike, don't start," Emma laughed. "We've only just arrived. Let us enjoy our holiday for a while before scaring us with scary stories." But Mike was serious. He was telling what he had heard from his grandfather, who had also hunted in these parts. It was said that this forest was not just thick and wild, but alive. It is skilled in observation, and those who trespass into its domain can feel its gaze upon them. Many who have slept here have reported strange rustles, movements in the dark, and even disappearances. However, no one could give a rational explanation for these phenomena. Mike's story awakened nervous tension in the friends. Emma tried to joke away, but her laughter was strained. Sarah, usually calm and unperturbed, cast anxious glances at the dark silhouettes of the trees beyond the firelight. Even Jack, the initiator of this whole trip, felt a chill run down his spine. The silence around them grew more and more oppressive. At one point, Jack noticed something strange. At the edge of the light from the campfire, where the darkness was consuming everything around him, he thought he saw movement. He strained, looking in that direction, but saw nothing else. "Did you see it?" he asked quietly, as if afraid to break the fragile silence. "Saw what?" Ben answered, looking round. "I think someone was there," Jack said, pointing into the darkness. But no one else had seen anything, and the friends went on with their conversations without paying much attention to it. The feeling of uneasiness, however, did not leave them. It seemed that with every new sound that came from the forest, their fear increased. First it was the faint rustling of leaves, then the faint crackling of twigs. At some point they all fell silent, listening to the sounds of nature, which no longer seemed so peaceful. After a little more time had passed, Sarah and Emma decided to go in search of wood to keep the fire going. They took their torches and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving the others in the camp. Their friends could still hear them laughing and talking for a long time, but then silence enveloped the forest again. Half an hour passed, then an hour, but the girls never returned. Jack began to worry, but Ben tried to reassure him. They must have just got carried away on their walk. These places are beautiful, especially at night. But Jack couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He'd heard more than once about how easy it was to get lost in the woods at night, even if you had a torch. Finally, his patience ran out and he decided to go after the girls. Ben and Mike decided to go with him, not wanting to be alone in the camp. Taking their torches, they set off along the same path as Sarah and Emma. The forest greeted them with an eerie, ominous rustling, tree branches leaning as if to block their path. With each step, the darkness thickened, and the boys began to feel the forest seem to come alive around them. The trees that had seemed motionless during the day now loomed over them. They walked further and further, but there was no sign of the girls. Their anxiety was growing by the minute, and Jack began to shout. At one point, when they were beginning to think about going back to camp, Jack suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning to his friends. There was a faint rustle in the silence of the forest. It was muffled, as if someone were sneaking behind the trees. Suddenly a cry came out of the darkness. Not a human cry, but a different, wild and primal one. It was a scream of pain and horror, a scream that made the blood run cold in his veins. Jack darted in the direction from which the sound had come. His heart pounded frantically in his chest, but he kept running without looking back. Ben and Mike followed him, but the darkness grew denser and denser, hiding them from each other. The bodies of Sarah and Emma lay before him. Their faces were contorted in a grimace of horror, eyes wide open as if they had seen something incredible in the last seconds of their lives. Their bodies were mutilated, as if they had been mauled by wild beasts, but there was no trace of blood or any other sign of struggle around them. Jack felt fear gripping him, paralyzing his every movement. The forest around him suddenly became even more hostile, as if it had come to life itself, feeding on their fear. The rustles became more distinct, and in them could be discerned the sound of footsteps that were coming toward them. "We must go!" Gasping for breath, Jack exhaled. They turned and rushed back toward the camp, but with every step it became clear that the forest was not going to let them go. The branches of the trees seemed alive, clinging to their clothes, blocking their way, and the darkness grew thicker, as if it would swallow them up in its dark embrace. From left and right came strange moans and screams. When they finally reached the camp, their hearts were pounding frantically and their minds were gripped by panic. It seemed that the forest itself would not let them go without a fight. However, the camp looked as if no one had touched it since they left. The campfire had finished, leaving only smoldering embers, and the tent stood untouched. "We have to get out of here," Jack said with desperation in his voice, his hands shaking as he tried to start the car. But the key wouldn't turn in the ignition. Ben and Mike looked around nervously, sensing the growing menace around them. "What's going on? Why won't it start?" Ben panicked as Jack tried unsuccessfully to revive the engine. Something strange was starting to happen around them. Rustling and moaning from the woods grew louder, as if something was getting closer. Strange, indistinct figures began to loom in the darkness beyond the headlights. They moved slowly, as if dissolving into shadows, but they came closer and closer. "This can't be real," Mike whispered, horror in his eyes. He pointed to one of the figures that seemed to float above the ground. The figure resembled a man, but its outline was blurred, unnatural, and instead of a face, there was a dark void. Jack, realizing that time was running out, jumped out of the car and rushed to the boot, trying to get something to defend himself with. At that moment, the engine suddenly started, illuminating the space around them. The light of the headlights brought out of the darkness the very creatures that had been hiding in the shadows before. They were not human beings, but something that looked more like the reanimated dead. Their pale, distorted faces expressed intolerable pain. Their movements were slow but steady. They were moving toward the boys, and it seemed as if nothing could stop them. Jack, wasting no time, jumped back into the car. He tried to start it again, and this time the engine started. The car sped off, and they ran away from here. The light of the headlights blinded them, pulling the trees and bushes out of the darkness, but the forest didn't seem to want to let them go. The road, which at first had seemed simple and straight, now became a confusing maze. The branches of the trees overhung the road as if trying to hold them back. From behind came ominous sounds, moans, screams, and rustles that wouldn't let them go even at high speed. "Faster! Go faster!" Ben shouted, looking back, where in the light of the taillights he could see figures approaching. But no matter how fast they drove, the shadows kept up. They drove the car to the limit, and it was only when the woods began to thin and the road became more level that they realized that they had finally broken free. But even then, none of them dared to look back. Early in the morning, they reached the city. All three of them were on the verge of exhaustion, both physically and mentally. They hadn't exchanged a single word, traveling home, trying to forget what had happened, but forgetting was impossible. Every night when they fell asleep, the nightmares returned. In their dreams, the forest came alive again. Dark figures stalked them again, and screams broke the silence. Even in reality, Every rustle, every faint sound made them flinch and look round. The days passed and the friends tried to get back to normal, but something had changed forever. They were no longer the carefree bunch that had once gone on holiday in the forest. Their lives became a series of anxious days and sleepless nights full of fears. One day Jack, unable to bear it, decided to return to that very spot. He had to find out what had happened that night. But when he found himself back in those places, the forest greeted him with its familiar silence. No sign of the camp, no hint of what had happened. It was as if it had vanished into the fog of his memory. But Jack knew that the forest remembered. He returned home with an even heavier weight on his heart, knowing that the solution to this horror would never give him peace. The forest lives according to its own laws, and those who have once disturbed its peace remain its prisoners forever, if not in body, then in soul.